It's a very well-behaved audience, thank you. Good evening, welcome. My name is Arnon Menon. For those who don't know me, I'm Director of the UK in a Changing Europe. And before we get formal proceedings going, let me do a couple of things. Firstly, just to thank our funders, the Economic and Social Science Research Council, who I'm delighted to be able to announce have just extended our funding through to June of 2019. So a special thank you to them. You may clap. And secondly, and in a minute you'll understand why I didn't go into marketing, I've been instructed to tell you, please visit our website, please follow us on Twitter, please sign up to our newsletter if you're interested in Brexit, because we are the place to be. Though some other websites exist as well. Those of you who know us will know that we host a large number of events, but I have to say, over the last couple of years, there hasn't been one I've looked forward to more than this one. It was good luck rather than good management that led to it falling on the first day of the negotiations and after an election that has made Brexit very much a subject of debate again. But even before those events, I was very much looking forward to this, and now I am even more so. Our speakers need no introduction, so I'll do it very, very quickly. To my left is Will Straw, who was Chief Executive, was that the title, of the Britain Stronger In campaign. Heather Stewart, who is the Joint Political Editor of The Guardian. And to her left, Matthew Elliott, who was Chief Exec of Vote Leave. The structure we had in mind for this was that I was going to sort of quiz the panel for the first half of proceedings and then throw it open to questions. If you can keep your questions short and polite, I would be very, very grateful indeed. We'll aim to finish at about 8:30 so that you can see the setting sun. So, without more ado, and Matthew, if I may, I'll start with you. What for you was the most surprising or unexpected thing to happen during the referendum campaign?
There are so many different moments to choose from. I sort of see visions of finding out I was being trailed by a private detective, not sent by Will, by the Leave campaign, being served a legal writ by Aaron Banks. That was quite interesting. Being told that the Sergeant-at-Arms was about to arrest me for not giving evidence to the Treasury Select Committee. That was quite interesting too. But a serious one, I would say Obama's visit, which we thought would be a huge game changer for Will's campaign for Stronger In. And as it turned out, because I think he went one step too far by saying that Britain would be sent to the back of the queue, I think had the opposite effect than you hoped it would. So that was a key moment for me.
What I really want to know is whether it was just a very, very bad private detective or whether you have experience of this sort of thing at counter-surveillance and managed to spot him. But anyway, Heather.
There were lots, really, but I suppose I was going to pick a kind of a crystallising moment, which was when we did something that political journalists probably don't do enough of, and went and spent some time with some voters, and we'd got with the brilliant we'd got the brilliant Britain Thinks to get together some focus groups for us, and I went down to Brighton, and it was a group of Remainers, we'd been told, who'd agreed, bless them, to spend the evening having a glass of wine and some sandwiches and answering a whole load of questions about what they thought about Brexit. This was a room full of supposed Remainers, and I sort of sat there scribbling at the back of the room, and what came over repeatedly was nothing in the government's kind of messaging, nothing George Osborne had said, none of those, you know, posters with a doormat with 4,300 quid on that was supposed to convince us to stay in. None of that was cutting through at all, and the only thing everybody remembered was the 350 million quid on the side of the bus, and that was a moment where I thought, these political geniuses who were running the In campaign, particularly the sort of thinking of Osborne and Cameron and the way that they were stage managing it and the way that they were using the sort of Project Fear approach, this is absolutely not working, and it was a real kind of, you know, made me see, it was about halfway through, and so it then made me see a lot of the other events that we were then taken along to, where, you know, wow, here's George Osborne in an aircraft hangar and he's got Ed Balls and Vince Cable with him, amazing, you know, except actually those people in that room wouldn't have been the slightest bit impressed by that, and they'd have said, of course you would say that, and I don't believe it, you know. So
yeah, I mean,
it sort of reframed it for me.
I've sort of lost all sense of time since the referendum, which sort of feels like it was a decade ago now, and I just can't place anything chronologically anymore.
Yeah, really, yeah.
Will?
Well, I think for me, the clear moment that stands out was the murder of Jo Cox, who was a close friend. My wife worked with her for many years, so that day will be etched in my mind forever. For those who knew her, and I think everyone who didn't, who's seen the tributes over the last year and certainly over the last few days with the documentary last week and the wonderful great get-together celebrations over the weekend, can see what an amazing spirit she had. And of course it wasn't really anything to do with the referendum. I think people who will have seen the documentary last week will know that it was a slightly unhinged guy acting alone, but it did completely change the national mood, and to be going into the final week of a campaign on such a big issue, I'm sure for Matthew and his team, as well as in Stronger In, particularly when you knew the person and knew friends and family who were affected by it, and had to sort of slow down this juggernaut that was building up to the final week, was sort of personally incredibly tough few days to get through, and I think the whole country was affected by it, and that in a way I think brings us nicely to the anniversary of that awful event and what happened over the weekend, because our country has been going through a difficult time recently. The awful events in West London, the series of terrorist attacks, the political instability at the moment, I think all makes us really concerned about what's happening in our country. So to have Jo's voice not silenced but allowed to bloom in the way that it has, and to see those wonderful events all across the country where people recognised that they had more in common than that which divides us, I think is really important. It's an important thing that we now need to take forward with Brexit, because nothing to do with that. It was a divisive referendum and there have been a divisive tone to our politics, and I think if we're going to get through the years ahead, we need a bit more of Jo's spirit.
Absolutely, and strikingly, the number of divisions that you now see in our society are really quite frightening, aren't they? The number of different axes along which we are polarised is something I can't remember in my lifetime. But moving on, this is a question to all of you in any order, I suppose, and feel free to be honest. Were you surprised by the outcome of the referendum, and did your thinking on what the result would be shift as the campaign was going on? So did you start off thinking one thing and halfway through start thinking another? Who wants to go first on that? Or shall I point at someone?
I don't mind. I mean, I certainly, as I was sort of hinting just then, I certainly began the campaign thinking, the government have all the resources. There was that period where they had the civil service at their disposal, and so they could produce these wonderfully glossy, leaflets telling us all about the potential costs of Brexit and so on. And, these are people who won a general election, convincingly in 2015, not long ago. Surely they're going to walk it. And it was during the tone and the way that it moved throughout, and to some extent the contrast between those rather clinical Remain events where there were no real people in the room, there were no voters in the room, and the rather kind of, I'm not quite sure how to describe it, more sort of rambunctious kind of approach of the Leave campaign, getting out there, getting out of the bus and chatting to people, and which reminds me a little bit of the general election campaign, where I've spent time in the last, everything slightly, you can imagine that's what I've spent my last kind of month or so doing, and sitting on a blue bus where you don't see a single voter and everything's very organised, and sitting on a red bus where everything's somewhat chaotic, but you get out and you meet the voters and there's shouting and people have brought their kids, and so I think I wouldn't have told you the night of the Brexit vote I thought we were going to go out, but I did think it was a distinct possibility, which I think a lot of my colleagues and others around me didn't.
I have to say, my first thought when I saw the government leaflet wasn't about the content, but they'd been ripped off spending £9 million on something quite so horrible looking. I mean, it just wasn't a very impressive looking document. But anyway, Will.
No, I'll be honest. I mean, I think like everybody, when the campaign started, we knew it was going to be a tough campaign, but we expected to win. And I think what happened was, it was very much to Heather's timing. You started off, as the campaign geared up in the early part of 2016, that the debate was almost entirely about the economy. And I think actually we had the better of it, and there was debates about, and we're still having it now, what would our economic model look like outside the EU? And this sort of carried on. We had a number of different ways of trying to focus on that debate. And I think ultimately two things happened. First of all, people got a bit bored talking about the economy. I think the lobby probably got a bit bored of going back over that debate again and again about what would the implications be for the economy.
I should say I never get bored of talking about the economy. But anyway.
Well, you're an economic correspondent who's ended up in the political brief. But I think certainly we found it got harder and harder to make that important argument. The other was that, and I mean, I'm interested in Matthew's view on this, but it felt to us like there was a pivot inside the Leave campaign. You'd had Dominic Cummings in 2014 saying that they didn't need to and wouldn't prosecute a campaign based on fears around immigration. In a sense, they didn't need to. And instead, you had over the last 4 weeks, from that point, 4 weeks to the polling day where the immigration figures came out, a relentless focus on immigration, on numbers, on the sort of shadow government that you concocted with Boris Johnson and Michael Gove bringing out a new announcement every day about a points-based system or what pressure on immigration would cause in this sector or that sector. And it completely changed the terms of debate. And from that point, the polls changed quite rapidly. We also, after the postal votes went out, you started to get feedback from people doing something they shouldn't do, but which happens anyway, which is that pointy heads for different political parties go and sit in town halls and watch the ballot papers being opened, and they just sort of mentally note which way it's going. And we knew at that stage that among postal votes, we were down about 60-40. So you would expect there to be more pensioners voting, but that felt pretty hard to come back by. So we were really worried.
So when was that?
So that was, the postal votes went out at the start of June. So it was with about 3 weeks to go. Right. Now, as we entered the final week of the campaign, the polls swung back in our direction. So I think, going into the night itself, I'd be lying if I didn't say that I thought we would win, but I thought it'd be close. And of course, as you'll remember, all the polls on the day had us winning. So certainly was a shock. And after the result came in, we did the only responsible thing, which was to find a pub normally frequented by butchers, which opened at 6 in the morning, appropriately called The Hope. And the whole Stronger In team, joined actually by some of David Cameron's core team, just after he'd resigned, drank lots of Guinness and wine until drowned our sorrows. And actually, one of the interesting things about that was that most of the people who were in the pub had voted Leave. They were finishing their shift in Spitalfields Market, or they were construction workers. In fact, there were 2 builders who were cracking into a bottle of champagne at 7 in the morning. But it was divided Britain. But actually, it was interesting to have a conversation with them about why they voted that way, similar stories that we'd heard all the way through the campaign. But it was, in a sense, now the deed was done, it was quite nice just to sort of sit down, have a drink with people from the other side, understand what their issues were, and sort of reflect on what had been an incredibly intense year.
Did you believe the populist poll that came out on the day?
Well, there were 2 populist polls on the day. So there was the one that they, I think, did for a private sector client that had us winning by 10 points. Yeah. Now, that was different from the poll that they did for us, which we received, which had us winning by a narrow margin. I don't know why there were these 2 different numbers flying around, but I think on the day you had all of the polls saying that we would win, with the exception, he claims, of Aaron Banks's poll that Jerry Gunster did, which he claims got it bang on. But I didn't think we would win by 10 points. It just didn't feel like that. But yeah, I think like most people, I thought going into the night that we would win.
Matthew.
I think we have to go back to before the actual short campaign started. And I did my first serious polling on all of this in 2012, when the issue first started rising in the papers. And I think at the time, Leave was ahead, as it were, in sort of in or out. And then after David Cameron's Bloomberg speech, again, it varied in the different polls. But one clear thing was there, that if David Cameron came back with a deal that he sold the country, it shifted dramatically, and people expected the inside, or the Remain side as it became, to gain about perhaps 20 points from that, him coming back with a new deal. So for me, I would say the moment when I thought that this thing was actually winnable, because up until that point I thought it was going to be a tough thing, was the point he came back with the deal. And then, it didn't really amount to very much. It wasn't accepted in any of the media, really, even the Guardian and the BBC and the FT said it didn't really amount to very much. And then, of course, that led to Boris Johnson, crucially, joining the Leave campaign. I think it was at that point that I thought that actually we had a winning chance. I wasn't overly confident, but I thought that actually there was a path to victory.
How much do you think the campaign mattered? I mean, we political journalists always exaggerate the extent to which campaigns matter. But you think it wasn't baked in at that stage when he came back with that?
It wasn't
not
baked
very exciting
in,
deal.
but I think from that point we had a chance of winning, and I think because we had, perhaps I'm wrong on this, but from the outside, I think we had more flexibility as a campaign. We're more sort of lean and nimble. We didn't have an unwieldy coalition with UKIP and Nigel Farage, so able to really dictate our own agenda. Whereas I'm guessing from your side of things, because you had the major parties and perhaps the CPI and the trade unions, that sort of thing, it's a much more difficult campaign to run and to have that fast decision-making.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, we thought that, and I think in the focus groups it probably was a strength that we had this cross-party support, lots of different sectors of the economy and so on that were supporting the Remain cause. It made us look broad. And there was a point, I think you're right, that Boris going over was critical, because, I mean, if the Leave campaign had had as its figureheads Nigel Farage, Ian Duncan-Smith and Liam Fox, I think it would have been a harder task to have won. But having Michael Gove providing that intellectual ballast and Boris Johnson as the sort of tub-thumping campaigner,
and Giesler,
and Giesler as well, I think gave you huge range. And you're right that we were a coalition, so the board that we had that sort of managed the campaign was made up of people representing different parts of the political spectrum and different parts of civil society. But more importantly, we had this very difficult thing from February onwards, from when the government properly engaged after the renegotiation, which was that having created this vehicle, built an organisation that was nationwide, that had organisers in every corner of the country, that built up an email list of 500,000 people, that had done all the work on the research, the focus groups, the polling, to try and understand what was the best message to try and win the country with. Once we put all of that in place, you then had the decisions taken in number 10, not in the campaign war room. And the Conservatives who came across, particularly during the Purdah period where they couldn't work in number 10, built up a very collegiate atmosphere with us. We worked very closely with them. You never read about leaks or sort of splits on our side, because we kept a lid on it, and we did work collegiately. And I think I didn't expect that when we started. But it was frustrating that there would be a 4 p.m. meeting in number 10 every day. Maybe once a week, once a fortnight, I'd been invited along to that. But most of the time, you're being told what the decision is. And sometimes you'd have to fight a rearguard action and say, look, we can't make that work for these reasons. But I think in any campaign, you saw this in this general election, the Conservative campaign seemed to have about 20 different people running it. There wasn't one person who was driving it. Whereas in 2015, they had Linton Crosby. And in the 2016 referendum, Matthew, Dominic Cummings and their team ran a tight ship, didn't let UKIP get involved, which I think was absolutely the right strategic thing to do for them, and were therefore able to make much more streamlined decisions. And of course, Dom got a lot of flack for the approach that he took. I think a lot of people on the Leave side, wanted his head, but he stuck with it because his instincts were there. He would have had an absolute roasting had he got it wrong, but he stuck with that. Yeah. Whereas, I lost some internal debates, other people did. It was frustrating.
Can I ask you to follow? Let me just assure, we are going to get on to the contemporary thing. I'm just getting my inner nerd out of me and talking about the campaign for a little while first. But Jeremy Corbyn is the new champion of the Remainers, apparently. How important was...
I don't think he is.
Apparently. How important was his role or non-role, do you think, in terms of how you fared?
Well, I mean, I was fairly honest about this after the referendum. I spoke to Laura Koonsberg and to Tim Shipman. I mean, there was no doubt at all that it was a frustration for us in the cross-party campaign that we couldn't properly engage with Labour's leadership. I had, when the campaign sort of properly got going in September, it took me 6 months to get a meeting with anybody in his team. And they didn't really want to engage, even though I'd been a Labour Party candidate in 2015. There's no doubt that was a frustration. I think my reflection is, given what a brilliant campaigner Jeremy Corbyn clearly is, he was in the 2 Labour leadership campaigns that he fought and ran a brilliant campaign in the general election, that if he had been willing to really campaign in the referendum as well, then it's possible we would have had a different result, because I think he would have reached parts of the electorate that we couldn't, certainly that David Cameron couldn't. But I think he's played a blinder, actually, in terms of the positioning of Labour in the general election. I mean, we've just seen what happens when one party, the Liberal Democrats, takes an overtly Remain position. You know, it's close to my position, but that they bet everything on it and got, you know, a little bit of an increase, but their vote share went down, and they certainly didn't have the gains they were expecting, even in places like Vauxhall, where Kate Hoey is the MP. And on the other side, Theresa May prosecuted a hard Brexit strategy, trying to get a mandate for hard Brexit, essentially saying, I want all of those 52% of people. And she found that in the end, lots of those UKIP people went back to Labour rather than to the Conservatives, and she prized over some Labour leavers, but not as many as she hoped, resulting in just 5 gains for the Conservative and, as we know, over 30 losses. So I think Jeremy Corbyn, by sort of having that position that he did, saying we want to have an economy first, jobs first Brexit, but not being too drawn on what that meant, did mean that people from both sides have supported Labour. Yeah.
To what extent do you think his analysis was based on the Scottish referendum? So seeing how when Labour was quite close with the Conservatives in Scotland and then got really heavily defeated in the general election afterwards, do you think he feared the same thing would happen with the EU referendum?
Yeah, that was definitely a fear, definitely a fear. No doubt about it. That was a fear that Jeremy Corbyn's team had. It's also, incidentally, the fear that Harriet Harman, when she was interim leader, had, and was one of the reasons for setting up the independent Labour Yes campaign, Labour in for Britain, you know, who we worked collegiately with, and Alan Johnson's team. But what was interesting was that I think things have changed in Scotland now, but in 2014, the Conservatives were a toxic brand in Scotland that barely got 10% of the vote. And by Labour doing this cross-party campaign, I think it cost them dearly with the anti-Conservative vote and cost all those seats. In the UK, you'd just come out of an election where David Cameron had secured 37% of the vote, where the Conservatives in large parts of the country were not toxic, certainly in the seats that Labour wanted to win if it was going to form a government. And we did some polling that showed that it was unpopular among Conservative voters to have shared platform events, but popular among Labour voters to have shared platform events. That was one of the arguments I used to try and get more of a cross-party feel to it. But in the end, we did get some sort of Labour veterans, people from the 97 to 2010 government, and we got some newer MPs who weren't on the front bench, people like Chuka Umunna, actually Yvette Cooper did lots with us, Stephen Kinnock, you know, people like that did things with the Stronger In campaign. But what the media wanted was the Labour leadership's point of view. And of course, you know, Jeremy Corbyn did get coverage for their position, but it would have worked better had we been able to integrate them into the messages and the overall planning that we were doing.
Heather and Matthew, can I just ask you sort of the other side? How important do you think it was that David Cameron refused to really go for Michael Gove and Boris Johnson? I mean, it seemed to me, watching from the outside, that actually he was a Prime Minister who assumed he was going to win, was thinking about patching up the Conservative Party after he'd won, and actually therefore refused to attack his 2 cabinet colleagues quite as aggressively as he might have. And you hear about this poster that they had ready to go.
Yeah, that was going to be our splash, that was. Still a sore point, that.
But do you think that really had an impact?
I think it had a huge impact. You know, all the hard work we'd done to differentiate Vote Leave from Leave.eu and UKIP could have very easily been undone with several posters and, you know, more criticism of Boris and Michael. So I think it was a huge factor.
This was one of the frustrations which speaks to the point I was making earlier. So, you know, in any campaign, you want to be able to frame yourself and your opponent in the best possible light. I mean, that ultimately is the job of a campaign. We in the core campaign team, in the cross-party team, felt that we were having one arm tied behind our back because we were not able to frame Boris Johnson as being a sort of flip-flopper chancer who'd written the 2 op-eds one way and the other, and really go for Michael Gove for denigrating experts and all the rest of it, because the team around David Cameron had their eye on what would happen after the referendum, the rebuilding of the Conservative Party, and therefore didn't want to unleash, as they kept on putting it, blue on blue. And they would say, and I have some sympathy for this, that, you know, if we do that, it'll just create a row, it'll just create a storm. But, you know, we were still getting incoming fire. and we needed to counterattack. And because Boris was such an asset, we had to go after it and weren't able to do that. And there was this incident that Heather got caught in
anecdote,
absolutely. So,
which was I got a call from the very enthusiastic James McGrory, who's kind of doing the press guy at Stronger In, saying, I've got a great story. We've mocked up a poster, and it's just like the ones where you set very successfully against Ed Miliband, where he was connected very closely with Nicola Sturgeon, with Alex Salmond. But, this is Nigel Farage with Boris Johnson in his top pocket, which is, great, wonderful, you're really going for the jugular, we'll put it on the front page. And at some point between this lunchtime, very overexcited lunchtime conversation and kind of 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, somebody at Tory HQ went very, very cold on the idea.
Well, I'll tell you what happened, because it's absolutely, it's a real lesson for campaigns. It's absolutely a lesson in why you need to have one core campaign operation, which is that there had been, I think it was on a Monday, wasn't it? There'd been a discussion on the Sunday, I'm pretty sure it was, on the Sunday evening, there'd been a sort of number 10 conversation where they had discussed this, the problem of Boris and Michael Gove getting away scot-free while they were getting hammered. And there'd been this suggestion that, well, why don't we just go for them? So we got the message back the following morning, we're going to go for it. So James says, Heather's the right person for this. I think the Guardian might splash this. Gets on the phone, phones Heather, and then somebody else who was in the meeting had interpreted it in a different way and said, no, I don't think we can do this. It has to come from Labour or from some other part of the campaign. We can't have our fingerprints on this. And so James had to do something which is a really tough thing for a press officer to do, which is to phone somebody up and say...
And lie.
Well, say I'm really sorry.
We've got some copyright problems with the image. And,
come up with whatever you can to try and claw back this problem.
So
and I think
it up since.
it's real credit to James, because he was...
Don't you think to some extent, though? I mean, it was those were kind of big moments, and it did feel like you were pulling your punches a bit.
Definitely.
But don't you think the way that Theresa May came out and kind of came through the crowd and won the Tory race afterwards, and the way that this election has gone, shows that to some extent voters are sometimes find it a bit distasteful, actually, some of this stuff, and don't like particularly the kind of slugging one way and the slugging the other way. And I know that's how it often goes, but look at everything that's been kind of all the orgy that's been poured on Jeremy Corbyn's head in the last, and we all thought, oh my God, they'll get Linton Crosby and they'll dig out all kinds of terrible things Jeremy once said in 1983. And actually, the voters, Labour didn't win, but they did far better than expected. And the voters actually don't seem to have taken terribly kindly, do they,
to this kind of... 2015 and Ed Miliband, where it seems
maybe. It's not clear to me that by saying beastly things about Boris Johnson, you would have made the difference. I don't know, who knows?
I don't know whether it would have made the difference at the end of the day, but what I do know is that we were fighting a campaign where we were quite clear and disciplined about what our own message was, and in the end it wasn't the right message to win, but we knew what we were saying, and the people that the Stronger In campaign was sort of organising were consistently making those points about Britain being stronger, safer and better off inside Europe than we would be on our own. What we weren't ever able to do was to frame our opponents, and that I think does mean you're fighting with one hand behind your back.
All right, I'm loving this, and I almost forgot we had an audience there who are probably more interested in the present than in the past. So, just to drag us into the sort of contemporary world a bit more. So, Heather, I'll start with you. I mean, what do you make of how the government handled Brexit since Theresa May went into Downing Street? So, straight after the referendum, what do you make of... I mean,
I was the other day, for reasons that are so sad that I won't even go into it, I re-watched the little speech that Michael Gove gave on the morning after, when he and Boris Johnson looked incredibly kind of shell-shocked, and he made a big point. He made as if they hadn't, they hadn't expected to win, and almost as if they hadn't wanted, although I'm sure that to win. Yeah, exactly. And we quite like David Cameron, really. But he said this needs to be a great kind of national project. We need to consult people from all parties. We need to talk to people from all parts of the United Kingdom. We need to make it very open and very consultative.
You just said it again, didn't you?
And he just said it again. But that was what made me think, I'm pretty sure I've heard this before. And go back, and it was what he said on the Today programme the other day was pretty much what he said in that speech. And actually, Theresa May has a very, very different way of operating, and it's closed, and it's private, and it's not at all collegiate or collaborative. And, any piece of information has had to be kind of kicked out of them by Parliament, actually very often by Labour MPs who got a lot of stick, but were giving actually have used all the tools they possibly could in Parliament to get as much information as they could, get this white paper, she wouldn't have made a speech setting out how she planned to negotiate unless she'd been kicked into it, which I just think it's such a kind of big defining national moment, and it's such a big national project. And I think you could have reached out to both sides and said, let's talk about what the trade-offs are going to be here. Or let's kind of try and facilitate some conversations among voters or in town halls or, in a way that... And at the time you sort of felt, well, OK, fine, we haven't got time, we need to trigger Article 50 straight away. But actually you had such a long period that you could have had a kind of proper national conversation in some sense in that period, which I just think we haven't had at all.
I think in some ways this was the downside of having a Remainer as a Prime Minister afterwards, in the sense that I think she felt she had to go above and beyond to stress how she'd accepted that Brexit meant Brexit.
Yes.
Whereas, of course, Michael Gove and Boris Johnson would have had the licence to be able to be more conciliatory and bring people together. Exactly.
Yeah, I think this is, I think we all know this is the single greatest peacetime project that Britain has sought to undertake since the Second World War. And Theresa May is temperamentally unsuited to this task. And we see that every single day. The approach and setup that she took to this issue in seeking to get this mandate for a hard Brexit, in essentially saying that I'm not even going to reflect the fact that this was ultimately quite a close vote, where 600,000 votes the other way would have changed the whole outcome. That I'm going to completely abandon the position, perhaps reluctantly, that she had during the referendum, and instead I'm going to pursue a view that will actually prioritise immigration over the economy and so-called unshackling of the ECJ's role over a economy first, jobs first referendum. It failed for her in the general election because people do not believe that no deal is better than a bad deal. On the whole, they don't believe that a hard Brexit is a better bet for the UK than a soft Brexit. And actually, I think people are starting to look at some of the arguments in the referendum in the cold light of day and realising they weren't quite right.
So you're expecting public opinion to shift over the course of the next 18 months? It is shifting.
And I'm not here today arguing that we should ignore the results of the referendum. Both sides entered into this knowing that it was a binding vote and the country voted to leave. But this is about the type of Brexit that we operate. And I think Theresa May got the strategy completely wrong. She's now had that rejected by the British people in the general election. But in relation to whole other areas of her approach to being Prime Minister, she's shown that she's unsuited to being transparent, to bringing a coalition with her, to taking on a negotiation. And I think that every day that she remains in power makes it harder and harder for Britain to have a positive outcome from Brexit.
That's balance for you.
There's a lot to respond to there. I think, generally speaking, she's got things right since the referendum. She took her time in triggering Article 50. There are some people who are urging her to trigger it right away, but actually by taking her time, it meant she had the time to set up the Department for Exiting the EU, the Department for International Trade, to actually work out the negotiating position. So she took her time on all of that. Yes, the general election has shown that she is not the greatest campaigner ever. But I think in terms of the management of government and actually sort of doing things in a very methodical way, and also I think in terms of picking the open Brexit approach over the closed Brexit, and I disagree with the, I think you're trying to sort of pigeonhole me as wanting to put immigration first, whereas you're the guy who wants to put the economy and jobs first.
Is that wrong?
I think it is wrong. So I think that the key thing we talked about at Vote Leave was about controlling migration. It wasn't talking about zero migration, about controlling it. And what we got in our research from the public was actually they recognised that we need to have both skilled workers and less well-skilled workers coming to the UK, but they want the government, the democratically accountable government, to be able to control that. That's a really key point. I think with regards to the type of Brexit,
can we just pause before we get on to that? Because I just want to follow up one thing about Theresa May that you said, which is I can see how you can make the argument that she's the right sort of leader to have if she enjoys a comfortable majority in the House of Commons. Is that she's purposeful and she gets on with her job and whatever other cliche we choose for today.
Strong and stable.
Thank you. But surely, temperamentally, you need a wholly different sort of Prime Minister to deal with the situation of a minority government. You know, she made great play of not being clubbable. But don't you have to be clubbable and in the bars and committee rooms of the House of Commons all the time with members of your team if you have to shore up a minority government? So isn't this call for a different sort of Prime Minister?
Obviously, we're not in an ideal situation with regards to the majority. But one thing I would say is that actually, if you look at the manifestos of the parties, if you look at the Labour Party manifesto, it's very, very clear we're going to end freedom of movement, which sounds pretty much to me like you want to stop migration to the UK in the same sense as we've had it under the EU. It was quite clear in terms of leaving the single market. And actually, if you sort of delve into where Keir Starmer is, I think he's almost...
What you were saying about migration there, I mean, Keir Starmer could absolutely have said that. People weren't saying we want it dramatically cut, but they were saying we want more control over it. Yeah.
So I think when it comes to the mandate question, between them, the Conservatives and Labour and the DUP got about 85% of the vote. And that, to me, is a pretty clear mandate for the sort of clean Brexit which the Prime Minister is pursuing.
Can you just spell out, I mean, maybe each of you, I mean, you might not want to do this, Heather, but what sort of Brexit would you like to see? I mean, avoiding soft, hard, open, closed, but in specific terms, when it comes to the court, when it comes to free movement, when it comes to payments into the budget, can you summarise a position?
Well, one thing that Will did massively well during the campaign, if I may say so, is constantly hound the Leave campaign about the sort of Brexit that we wanted. Do you want the Norwegian option or the Swiss option or the Icelandic option or the Turkish option? You did that really well.
The Albanian option.
Yes,
you forgot the Albanian.
Albanian,
yes.
Now, Michael Gove did a key speech in the campaign when we finally worked out what the line would be. And that line was basically leaving the single market, leaving the customs union, and having an EU-UK free trade deal. And that's the way in which the government's now going.
Well, my position hasn't changed. I think that if we want our economy to continue to thrive, to stay part of the single market and the customs union. And I accept that's different from, I'm a Labour person, but my position is different from the Labour manifesto. Although I think in the last week, Jeremy Corbyn's op-ed in the Sunday Mirror, Keir Starmer's interview with Heather last week, there is a shift as the outcome of the election comes into focus. And
surely virtually any statement is compatible with the Labour policy because it's so wonderfully ambiguous on virtually everything.
Which, as I said earlier, does seem to have worked electorally. But my view is that we have to put the economy first, and that there are trade-offs in this process that have not properly been highlighted by the government, and we owe it to the British people to be clear about them. And those trade-offs are as follows. If you want to end freedom of movement, then you will leave the single market and the customs union, and that will mean that we will not have the same advantageous trade arrangement with our nearest neighbours responsible for almost half of our exports.
Not necessarily the customs union, surely.
If we
end freedom of movement.
No, sorry, that's true of the single market.
Yeah.
For the customs union, if we want to avoid a hard border with Ireland, then there's no way that we can do that if we leave the customs union. These are hard trade-offs, and we need to wake up to the reality of it. If we want to get a free trade deal with the EU, then we will need to settle a divorce payment, and that is likely to be significant. These are all stages that we are now on, and whether or not people like it or not, over the coming years, these trade-offs will come into sharp relief. And you can continue to live in a world that says that we can wish away these trade-offs because we're the fifth largest economy in the world and because plucky British spirit is going to fight those damned Europeans and the German car makers don't want to lose their market over here. You can carry on making those arguments. It does not change the reality. And the reality is that a lot of these arguments that have been made over the last couple of years are going to start to disintegrate like a sandcastle on a beach at the end of a summer trip. And I think when that happens, people are going to feel... Yeah, it's not basically what I've been spending most of the last year doing. But I think when that happens, people will start to see what the reality of this is. And of course, I'm not saying we can't survive as a country. I'm not fatalistic about this. I think there are opportunities for us, but there are also trade-offs. And if what we really value is ending free movements and ending the jurisdiction of the ECJ, we will be poorer.
Do you want to come in on this?
See, I think, to some extent, I think people did understand that there was some price to pay for taking control over migration, and they put their hands up for that, I think. I mean, I don't know how big that price was, and maybe that's a conversation that needs to be had. So I think there is an economic cost.
Well, Nigel Farage said it, didn't he? He said it out loud.
And the government said it over and over and over and over again, and then people said, yeah, I'll take that, and I'll take making the decisions. And I do think there is something about, you know, whatever we think about our politicians, they are politicians. You know, we elect them to Westminster. We know what we want them, and not some guy over there to decide what we do with our money. And I think that is actually quite a resonant argument, even though it might not seem very resonant to some of us who kind of live in London and are rather sort of metro and travel around the place and citizens of nowhere, or whatever Theresa May likes to call us. I think it does. That is quite resonant, and I think you can't go back on that, and therefore I think people have said we're willing to make that trade-off to some extent. How far along that line you go, I don't know, but I think we're going to see that.
And Matthew, do you accept that these trade-offs exist?
I think that if the government didn't follow the wishes of the people and take Britain out of the single market, and let's not forget, time after time, people on the Remain campaign talked about a vote to leave as a vote to leave the single market. That was extremely clear.
Michael Gove said it in that speech, didn't he? I watched that speech.
Michael Gove said it, but David Cameron and George Osborne said it too, and other spokespeople for the campaign.
It's also true.
And I think if
Hannan talked up the Norway model and the Swiss model and so on, and continue to do so.
But it wasn't what the Vote Leave campaign talked about. And I think if they didn't end freedom of movement, the blowback from that, it would make the blowback from the dementia tax seem like a sort of minor tremor compared to the earthquake that if they didn't implement the end of freedom of movement. I think it would be huge politically, so I think they've got to implement that.
One other thing I
would
just...
You don't have to put your hand up. That's fine. Yeah.
One other thing... That's a typical woman there, so I just put my hand up on the back. One other thing, I think, is that actually what this general election result tells you, I think, to some extent... So way back in the immediate aftermath of the referendum, Jeremy Corbyn's sort of close team, who weren't then seen as quite the political geniuses they now are, were already saying, I think this is not necessarily, it's a vote about migration because of the impact on the labour market, but it's also a vote about people who feel like the model we've got ain't working for them, people who feel left behind, people who feel, you know, we might have recovered from, you might say we've recovered from the crash, but I don't feel like that to me, thank you very much. And I do think, you know, I'm slightly terrified about what happens over the next 2, 3, 5 years and what we end up with, but part of the reason the Remain argument didn't work that well is because a lot of people felt, you're telling me I'm going to lose something, but actually things are pretty crap. For me, so I want, you know, and some people may feel that plunging out of the system that we have, even if it's into the unknown, might give us a chance of, you know, solving some of these great long-standing problems that the UK economy has that we all know are very,
So who do those
difficult.
people vote for next time if things get worse for them?
Very hard to know. Jeremy again, presumably, I don't know. But I wonder how strong that argument, I wonder how big the downturn needs to be. I mean, if you're asking whether opinion will change, that, OK, there's an argument, already the housing market's starting to slow, already investment seems to be slowing down, maybe we do get a downturn and maybe that makes people change their minds. I don't know, but...
I think Heather's absolutely right that, you know, because so many people were feeling the wage squeeze and the downturn in the economy, that there was incredulity that, you know, you don't understand my life, you're saying it's going to get worse. It's pretty bad already. But I don't see how you help those people by removing our trade links at the sort of level they are at the moment with our closest European market. On immigration, if I may, because this clearly was a big debate in the referendum and continues to be. I don't want to sound tone deaf on it, but you know, it's interesting that Matthew says that the Vote Leave approach was about control of migration, not numbers. That didn't always feel like the tone of the campaign, if I'm honest, with the posters about Turkey is coming and so on. Nor is it the tone of Theresa May's government, because given the opportunity to abandon her migration cap policy, which George Osborne's Evening Standard tells us was opposed by, I think, almost every cabinet minister.
They're going to change its name, aren't they, to George Osborne's Evening Standard?
I think they probably should do. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
She ploughed on with it. But I think we need to be really clear about where public opinion lies on this, because there are concerns. It is the case that there has been quite rapid migration to some parts of the country that's put pressure on public services, that's put pressure on local labour markets. The Vote Leave campaign definitely tapped into that sentiment. But when you ask people what they feel about people coming to this country, by sort of 8 in 10, 9 in 10 people say that if people come here, work hard, pay their taxes and contribute to society, they should be welcomed. What they don't want is people coming here and having something for nothing. And actually there are provisions within the freedom of movement rules that allow us to...
Do you think there's more that we
I think there's a lot more that we do.
do.
Liechtenstein has an absolute emergency brake on numbers, and I think that is something that... No, I do think that's something that we should look at. We should test Brussels. We were always being told by Vote Leave that David Cameron didn't get as good a deal as he could have done, and I think there should be an opportunity to put that to the test and see whether we can actually get out of free movement what it was originally meant to be, which is free movement of labour, so that actually we use some of the provisions that are in there. If people are in this country and don't have a job after 3 months, we have every right to send them home.
But they're not going to give us a deal
No.
as a non-member that they wouldn't give us as a member, are they?
No, I think that's absolutely right. This is about the conversation we now have about the terms of exit. I think we are going to leave the European institutions. We are not going to send MEPs to the European Parliament in Brussels and Strasbourg. We're not going to sit at the European Council. We're not going to have a commissioner. But there is a live debate at the moment, particularly in light of the general election result, about whether we stay in the single market and enjoy the tariff-free trade and the frictionless regulations that we do at the moment, about whether we stay in the customs union and avoid a hard border with Ireland and enjoy the 50-plus free trade deals we have around the country. That is a live debate at the moment. The trade-off is that we would have to accept some kind of free movement. And I think the interesting question is how much can you stretch that so that we do get some control in this country at the same time that we make sure we don't imperil our economy. I know it won't be popular with everyone in this room, but I think this is absolutely critical for the years ahead, because if we embark blindly on this view that the referendum result explicitly meant that we pull out of the single market and customs union, I think we'll be in real trouble.
Can we just be quiet while people are speaking? We're going to turn to questions in a minute, but No, you can't just yet, because Matthew wants to come back first, and then we'll do questions.
I think politicians lost the trust of the people on migration when it came to the eastward expansion of the EU. So when that started happening, and Tony Blair was saying how he thought it would lead to about 13,000 migrants a year, I think, coming to the UK, and I think it ended up being, was it 2.2 million during the course of the Labour government? At that point, the public lost trust in politicians and their ability to be able to get a deal which would control migration. And that's why I think they want the UK Parliament to actually determine what sort of migration we have. And they don't accept the idea you could still have free movement in any form whatsoever. Politicians have lost the trust of the people on that. And let's also forget with the customs union point. People want the UK to be able to do trade deals now. We've got the Department of International Trade. We want a trade deal with the US and India and China and all these other countries. That's part of the debate too, which you couldn't have if you're still part of the customs union.
What do you make of that poll that's just come out that says that 60-odd% of people want to stay in the customs union? You could say rogue poll if you like, because it might be
a populist poll, perhaps. If you do polling asking people if they want to do trade deals with the rest of the world, they'll say yes to that.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, it did actually, and 27% supported it. But I think public opinion is shifting on this, on these questions around single market and customs union, which we didn't really get into in the referendum.
Just to warn you, I can't see back further than three rows, so if, is there any way we can have a bit of light? Thank you very much. Oh, look at that. All right, are there mics? Brilliant. All right, we're going to ask this gentleman in the front because he's been waiting more or less patiently to... You have a mic and everything.
What's coming across clearly from Will Straw is that the British public got the referendum wrong, and it is now up to a sort of elite to correct that by producing a result which isn't actually leaving the European Union at all. If you don't leave the single market, if you don't leave the customs union, you might not send MEPs, or you pay some sort of Danegeld to the Europeans as well. We're actually still in the European Union, but under worse conditions. And that is what he wants to engineer. And that is going to produce some sort of trouble. Another final point I want to make, immigration. This has nothing to do with xenophobia or racism or anything. We simply, in this country, cannot build enough houses per year. It doesn't matter for what reason. It is a fact we can't build enough houses for the net increase of population from abroad coming into this country. And that is going to produce it is producing a massive social crisis. So immigration is an issue.
If I can...
You can. Let me just, before we get into this properly, let me just say, I'm sometimes not going to ask all three of you to respond to every question, but I mean, if you desperately want to, you obviously can respond to this.
To put my views in my own words, I absolutely believe that we had a vote last June to leave the European Union. I'm absolutely clear about that. I, like everybody else, entered into that process knowing what the outcome of a leave vote would be. What my contention is that the precise nature of what Brexit looks like is up for debate. And there were different versions of that put in the general election. This debate must continue. And the very clear rejection of Theresa May's approach to hard Brexit means we have to reconsider this. And on the housing point, I think the simple answer to this is that neither the current Conservative government nor the previous Labour government built enough houses. These were political decisions not to build enough houses. We can, as a country, if we want to, build more houses. And what we know, particularly in relation to EU migration, and people don't like this, but there's been so many studies on this, that EU migration, and you'll tell me if I'm wrong on this, EU migration has been a net benefit to our economy. Has that been distributed evenly? Absolutely not. And we should do much more to make sure that those areas of the country that have ended up with very large population inflows relative to their local size get the resources they need for housing, for public services, and so on. That is a political choice about how we manage our economy and our resources. It's not that having lots of people coming to this country has meant that we have lost the ability to build houses.
Gentleman here. And then...
A question. When you go into negotiations, you don't state what you're going to negotiate before you get in. Brilliant. You actually take the furthest point away. That's why they're demanding 100 million from us, or 100 billion from us. If we tell them that we want the single market, we want customs union, we've got nothing to negotiate. We have to start at two separate ends. What do you think of that, in fact, all the time?
Yeah. I'm happy to answer that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, Theresa May, when she became Prime Minister last summer, set out on a course saying what her interpretation was of the mandate that both the Conservative Party received in 2015 and the referendum result, and she was going to take that into the negotiations. She chose, no one else, she chose to put that mandate to the British people, and they rejected it. That's why we're now changing our position, or to have a debate about changing our position.
Hang on, let him keep going.
A mandate for Brexit or not?
There's clearly a mandate for Brexit. The question is, what are the terms of that Brexit? And I think that's the conversation that we need to have at the moment, because, straightforwardly, there is not a parliamentary majority for these negotiations to carry on until she gets a Queen's speech through and is clear about what the terms she wants.
Roughly speaking, your position on what we should do now was articulated by the Lib Dems, by the SNP, by the Green Party, all of whom saw their vote share fall during the recent general election. So I don't like this idea of mandate.
First of all, it was very clear in the election where the Remain vote went. In seats like Battersea and Canterbury and Croydon, the Remain vote flocked to Labour. That was absolutely clear, because what they wanted to stop was the idea of Theresa May getting a landslide majority for the hard Brexit that she was going. The position that Keir Starmer... I mean, that's just what happened in seats like Battersea. No, Battersea voted 75% for Remain, and they rejected a Remain-supporting Conservative MP because they did not want to give Theresa May that majority. Quite straightforward.
Go one constituency along to Vauxhall with Kate Hoey, a very prominent member of the Leave campaign. Again, I'm not sure what the Remain vote was there, but similarly high. She got back in, and I think to increase the majority. So to interpret the general election purely along the lines of a Brexit vote, I think is wrong.
Heather, do you want to have a go at interpreting the general election?
To some extent, I think it's fair to say that people moved on from... A lot of the conversation was about domestic policy and about how we run the domestic economy. And you're absolutely right that Brexit will send huge shockwaves through that. But I think actually what Labour did by saying we absolutely accept this, we back Article 50, let's get on with it, was they then enabled themselves to open up all kinds of other really important conversations about the domestic economy and about social policy and about all kinds of other things that actually people feel very strongly about and wanted to talk about. So I don't know how much it was about Brexit, and actually the Lib Dems would tell you they thought it was the Brexit election and it wasn't.
We're going to move on. If you can keep your questions quick, we won't necessarily have a panel debate in each answer, so we can get as many of you in, but almost certainly not all of you. The lady here in the front.
In the spirit of making this a slightly less divisive debate, which I feel like this audience is fairly representative of the divisions in the country, it would be great to hear, Matthew, could you kind of describe one thing which we will concretely lose when we leave the EU, assuming we continue with Theresa May's vision for Brexit? And, Will, if you could describe one thing that you think we'll gain.
Do you want to ponder this for a moment and we'll take another question?
Yeah, good idea.
OK, there was a gentleman over there. We will come back to it, don't worry, I'll remember it, we won't forget.
Didn't the Remain campaign actually start to go wrong about 40 years ago? Because over the years, the successive British governments, Labour and Conservative...
I'm really sorry, but can you ask a question?
But that was the question. Didn't it go wrong 40 years ago?
Perfect.
Because successive British governments have never taken up the money on offer from the EC and EU for promoting a European demos. Now, this was the big element that was missing from the campaign. Does Will Straw recognise that there was a body of people for whom allegiance to the European Union was a matter of emotion rather than economics, and that seems to be completely missing from the whole campaign? I appreciate people that feel like that, probably not a majority of the Remainers, but was it a factor that could have made a difference?
Yeah.
Actually, before that,
I think there's, I mean, again, it depends on what the Brexit is, but let's say that we followed Matthew's version of Brexit and left the single market and customs union. There's no doubt that we would then gain the opportunity to trade with other countries around the world. That would be a demonstrable gain, but it would be a net gain because we would lose the existing trade deals that we have through the EU. So I think that's definitely something that we can... Do you want to... No, so the customs union allows us to access the 50-plus free trade deals that the EU has negotiated over a period of years. Now, I'm not saying that you couldn't start again and negotiate some of those deals, and I'm not saying that some of those countries might say, actually, we're happy to have it on the same terms. But I can tell you that countries that are larger than us will see it as an opportunity to try and change the terms in their favour. So it won't be the same as what we got before. In answer to the gentleman, I think he makes a very, very important point, which is that over the last 40 years, there has been a failure of parties on both sides of the debate to make a positive argument for Britain's place in Europe, for the role that the European Union played in bringing peace across Europe, prosperity to our country. And that argument wasn't made over a very long period of time. Now, the Stronger In campaign was set up a year before the referendum, and we did a lot of polling and opinion research, as you'd expect, to try and understand what the persuasive arguments were. What we found was, and I think Matthew would say the same, that you had about a third of the country that had absolutely made their mind up for Remain, a third for Leave, and there were a third in the middle who were undecided. And for those people, it was the economic arguments that at that stage seemed to be what would win out. There was one exception to this. Young people were much more driven by a more emotional case for staying in the EU. So away from the gaze of the sort of mainstream media, we had a very, very targeted campaign on campuses and through social media at young people. And the turnout of young people in the EU referendum was actually higher than in the recent general election. So I think on that side, we did succeed in motivating young people and potentially politicising a generation of people who hadn't voted in elections before. But of course, what you heard in the public debate, what you saw on the television screen, what David Cameron and George Osborne were talking about night after night, were the economic risks of leaving. And I think that's why people at the end felt it was a bit of an emotionally empty campaign. But we were doing things to the audience that mattered to.
Matthew, cost of leaving.
Sure.
I don't want to give you a flippant answer to this, but I think this is a good question. I think there are aspects of the EU that work well. It's done some good. And I think that during the course of the negotiations, we should try and sort of keep some of those elements. So let me just name two. I'm sure that people at King's College will have taken part in the Erasmus scheme. And that's something which has benefited lots of students over the years. Lots of scientists at different money get money from the Horizon scheme for scientific funding. So those are two schemes which I think have worked well and done a lot of good. And I don't think it's beyond the wit of man for us to actually both leave the EU and also continue to be part of these schemes. So, for example, there are Swiss students and Norwegian students who are part of the Erasmus scheme. There are Israeli universities and Canadian universities that get money from the Horizon scheme for scientific funding. So I think if we work out the bits which we think are working well, we can actually make sure there are the right sort of bilateral agreements to allow us to continue to be members of these schemes.
Can you not come up with something we're going to lose, whatever?
We're not going to lose.
Yeah, we want something we are going to lose, not something we could not lose if we play our cards right.
We'll lose some MEPs. Good answer.
I might come back to you on this in a bit, actually, but anyway, there's a gentleman there with it.
My question is primarily aimed at the Remainer side of the argument. At what stage in the campaign of the referendum did you realise what a well-orchestrated campaign of rebuttal you were up against? Some of your major players came up with extremely helpful, factual and positive arguments, but were immediately destroyed by rebuttal all the way through. To what extent did you realise that was happening and compensate for it?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, as someone who was fielding a lot of calls from both campaigns, I think there was rebuttal going on pretty fiercely in both directions. I can report.
No, I take my hat off to Matthew and his colleagues because in terms of running a campaign, they run a iconic campaign in the history of British politics. Obviously, didn't agree with the arguments. I didn't always agree with the tactics, but it was effective, and they won fair and square. What I do think helped them, and I think they, Matthew probably can see this, I think they skillfully exploited it, was the BBC's need for so-called balance. And what I think many of you would reflect on was that when you had these key arguments, for example, on where the balance of economic opinion lay on the impact of leaving the European Union, where you might have 9 in 10 economists on our side of the debate and 1 in 10 on the Leave side. The BBC felt they had to get both points of view, and the Leave side, we know, were absolutely ferocious in making sure that they got their point of view across. And that meant that the casual viewer of the BBC News, or indeed other broadcast channels, there are other news services, would watch the evening news and think that there was a balanced case on either side and wouldn't necessarily get the full weight of evidence from one way or another. And that was true on issue after issue, and I think it did cost us.
There's also an extent to which remains slightly, because there was a consensus about the economics, slightly overplayed its hand almost, and slightly almost clobbered people with this will be an absolute disaster. It wasn't the balance of opinions in favour of, worries about Brexit. It was this will be an absolute disaster. And George Osborne's punishment budget, where he stood up and said, I would have to whack up taxes by however many £1 billion, which anyone who knew anything about fiscal policy knew was absolute nonsense. And mocked up a kind of fake official budget document saying we would have to hit you with X, Y and Z. I mean, it felt as
I think that's fair.
Didn't voters feel they were being a bit kind of patronised and a bit kind of
No, I think that is absolutely fair. And of course, had it been the right strategy, we would have won. So I think that's right. And as I said earlier on, I think that actually it wasn't just sort of battering the public over the head. It was showing our cards a bit too early. I think we sort of ran out of road on the economic argument at precisely the time that the Leave campaign came in with the immigration argument.
So that was a Purdah issue as much as anything else?
No, it wasn't, because we could have and indeed wanted to carry on that economic argument. We still had lots of sort of announcements and ways of interesting the media, all the different sort of campaign tactics that you see. But, having successfully got the argument onto the economic terrain from the point of the renegotiation really up until the middle of May, then the immigration numbers came out. They, I think, were the second highest it had ever been. And as we discussed earlier, the Leave campaign exploited that. As I say, I think it was more about numbers than control. Matthew can argue that point. But it certainly shifted the terms of debate onto immigration. And then, and Tim Shipman documents this very well in his brilliant book about the campaign. There was a debate inside our campaign about whether we should engage the immigration debate, which some of us, myself included, felt that we should do, that you just couldn't possibly ignore this, or whether you should use immigration to pivot back onto the economy at every opportunity to try and ignore it and get back to our core economic points. And in the end, I think that we got that wrong, and we should have engaged with the argument, partly because there was this contradiction that actually Sadiq Khan focused on in the BBC debate around whether the Leave campaign were committing to lowering or indeed raising the numbers of people coming to this country, because there were materials that were being circulated, for example, in the Muslim community, saying leaving the EU would mean that there would be, in a sense, more space for people from South Asia to come to the country. And I think, if we'd engaged with the issue, we could have tackled that earlier.
Don't you think this should have been done a long time before that point? So, for example, when David Cameron did his speech, and I saw the fact that business was basically, supposedly, uniformly against having a referendum, and I saw the niche for, Business for Britain group, and realising that there were business people out there who needed a voice, who were more on the sort of Eurosceptical Leave side of things. So that was basically a 3-year effort in terms of sort of setting up this group and having that voice. So basically we got to the point during the referendum where we could have business people right across the country representing us in debates like this, in different town halls. That was a lot of hard work. So I feel that had the Remain side engaged on the migration debate, not during the campaign, but actually years out, then perhaps you could have made a change. But I'm not sure, I'm not convinced if you could have done that much during the course of the campaign.
Well, too right. And, I think as there hasn't been a, 40-year advocacy of Britain's important role for the EU in Britain's economy and so on, nor has there been people making a positive argument about the benefits that immigration brings to our country. So what we found was that, we knew what we wanted to say about immigration during the campaign, but David Cameron and the Conservatives were hamstrung by the migration cap. Because in a sense, in 2010, he put that policy in place that they had no hope of achieving, which ramped up expectations on immigration that could never be met. And on the other hand, as Matthew said earlier on, Labour politicians were always referred back to their decision to allow the Eastern European countries to enter with the miscalculation of how many people would come in by some extraordinary order of magnitude. So whenever... It wasn't a miscalculation, it was a misassumption. They assumed that every other member state would open its borders too. Well, that's absolutely right, and the result that they thought it would be tens of thousands rather than hundreds of thousands. But the result was that whenever somebody on our side of the debate, whether they were Conservative or Labour, went up, they struggled to get through an interview because they were being pinned back on their own record. You'd have Liberal Democrats who'd take a sort of valiant effort to make the argument, and they've always been a party that's been more comfortable making a sort of pro-immigrant argument, but they just didn't get the airtime of the two major parties. That was definitely a problem for us.
Gentleman there.
You were talking about tariffs. You've been talking about that since before the referendum, trying to frighten people. But the people who've got to worry about the tariffs are the BMW car makers in Germany. They sell cars. That's their business. And you think they're not going to sell to Britain because they have to pay a little tariff? It's ridiculous.
Matthew, you want to...
I mean, the gentleman is right that the UK is the biggest export destination for the rest of the EU. So I'm very confident they will want to have an EU-UK trade deal. And when people talk about how complicated this will be, they often refer to, like, the Canadian trade deal, for example. It's a completely different situation. We're in a situation here where, at the moment, like you say, there are zero tariffs, zero quotas, we've got the same regulatory systems. This isn't a difficult deal to do.
Can I come back to that?
Yeah, absolutely, you can, yeah.
There's no doubt that German car makers want to sell into the UK. They might also want to make more of the BMWs that are currently made at the Cowley plant in Germany as well. But it's a European Union. There are lots of competing forces. So the Frankfurt financial services industry would certainly like to take some of that business away from the City of London. And the Eastern European governments certainly want to keep freedom of movement going. So in the end, the BMW managers will not dictate the EU's policy. They will not dictate the EU side of the bargain. It'll be, as it is in this country through the parliamentary arithmetic, a aggregation of all those different interests. So I don't think any of us know what deal we will end up with. Maybe we will end up with a situation where we get tariff-free trade in goods but not services, which is what Canada has. Maybe we'll end up with tariff-free trade but with restrictions in terms of the non-tariff barriers. We just don't know at the moment because we don't know where these negotiations are going to go. What we do know, and the Europeans have been very, very clear about this, is that we will not get the same terms that we are leaving on unless we are happy to accept all of the rules of the single market, which we've discussed already this evening.
I will try and be more brutal.
Nor do you, sir.
It's worth saying,
I don't, and nor do you, sir.
It's worth saying also that the depreciation in sterling, which has already happened and already taken effect, and which appears to be largely a result of Brexit, as far as anyone can tell, has already made the cost of an awful lot of imported goods expensive and has pushed inflation up to its high rate. So there are real-world effects already, regardless of what deal we end up with.
All right, we're going to try and move through. There was a lady over there. I've got no idea where that microphone's gone. Okay, fantastic.
Hi, I'm interested in hearing the panel's view on what they think the outcome will be for the 3 million EU citizens living in the UK and the 1 million UK citizens living in the EU.
What's going to happen to UK and EU citizens? Does anyone? Do you want to?
Well, I think both sides really want to do a deal on it quite early, so it's not clear what the cut-off date will be, but I think we will end up with some kind of pretty good deal on that. You think?
I think so, and during the course of the campaign we made it clear that we thought that EU citizens living in the UK at the moment should be able to stay. In fact, I think Giza Stewart went out of her way to actually talk about it in that famous press conference the day after.
But can I just press you on that? Because this isn't, from the EU's perspective, this isn't about being allowed to stay. This is about rights guaranteed under the treaty now. And what the EU negotiating position is, this isn't about whether you can live in the UK or not. This is about you have certain rights as a citizen of the European Union. We expect our citizens to have those rights. Would you, for instance, be willing to accept what the EU position paper says, which is the European Court of Justice has to be the ultimate arbiter of whether those rights are respected or not?
I suspect that's one of those areas where they're setting out a very hard-line position and will then concede some ground.
OK. There's a lady miles away. I hope that's not on.
Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
Yep,
Hi.
perfect.
So, I mean, it's been very interesting listening to observing the demographic of the very clear divisions of the generations which are represented in this one audience. I've written for your think tank about the fashion industry and the impact that we know a very difficult or hard Brexit would be on the industry that I come from. So, for instance, if you talk about no tariffs, we know that there is not a single zip manufacturer in the entire UK, meaning that unless we have a good deal, anything, even that made in Britain, could go to a 25% increase if we go to WTO levels. So my question is, why do people who have had it so good don't want the same for the generations coming after them?
That's one for Matthew. Do you want to?
I must confess, I'm not an expert in the manufacturing of zips, but it strikes me that they're not only made in the EU, they're probably made right across the world. And if we have the right tariff arrangements, we will still be able to have zips imported into the UK for use in the fashion industry. Exactly.
There's one more over here.
Yeah, hi. There was actually 3 campaigns, and we haven't actually heard much about the third campaign, the Leave.eu campaign. And it would be interesting to hear from all 3 of you your perspective on what the role of it was, because I think for an observer of it, it seemed to help you guys that you could be the nicely, softly, oh, we're talking about control, we're not talking about numbers. And then they could go out and say, no, this is all about voting leave to reduce immigration. And we know after the fact, almost all the surveys that have done since, and asking people how they thought, what they thought they were voting on, a large proportion of Leave voters thought they were actually voting to reduce numbers, not just control immigration, but reduce immigration. And that wouldn't have been the perception had there not been this Leave.eu campaign. And there wasn't a flip side of that campaign on the other side. There wasn't a campaign trying to make a positive case for Europe on the other side, because it couldn't credibly be made by the official Remain campaign, because they've been harping on about Europe for 20 years, moaning about it, so they couldn't come out and now try and make a positive case. So you had a very negative case on one side and not the flip side of an independent campaign on the other side. So I think having two campaigns on the Leave side helped you enormously.
Heather, do you want to say something about Leave.eu?
Yeah, I think that feels right. I mean, Aaron Banks has written his book since, hasn't he, styling them as the bad boys of Brexit, as they call it. But actually, you know, they were able to be kind of outriders, and they weren't constrained by this, oh, we better not deepen the rift within the Tory party, because they were out there doing their own thing, and they could say rather outrageous things. And we were sitting there on The Guardian, you sort of almost don't want to give a voice to it, but at the same time, it was, you know, it was sort of fascinating. It was, it was great copy. It was fascinating. It was lively. It was kind of outrageous, and they were able to do things that you couldn't do if you were constrained by sort of the rules of kind of normal party politics. A little bit, to be honest, a little bit as Momentum has been able to function. It's for the Labour Party. It's sort of slightly, you know, a little bit sort of further to the fringe. It's livelier, it's fast-moving, it sometimes gives you a sharp intake of breath, but it's like a kind of ginger group. It sort of livens things up, and it can say things without being completely constrained.
So, Matthew, were you secretly chuffed to have them there?
Just going back to what Will was saying earlier. One key thing about...
the room, but outside the room. I mean, it's...
One key thing about that middle third of voters was the fact that they didn't want to feel they were voting UKIP by voting Leave. So by having the Vote Leave campaign, it meant they could feel they were voting with Boris Johnson and Michael Gove and Gisela Stewart. So yes, it did have the effect of almost having that sort of middle party, that centrist party, if you like, coming through the centre. So it was massively helpful, but it wasn't in any way designed like that. There weren't sort of secret meetings going on about how we could set up the optimal campaign.
There were some secret meetings, weren't they? I mean, some of your colleagues were having secret meetings with them. There were efforts by some of the people on Vote Leave's board, although they may have left the board later on, about whether there should be a formal merger between the campaigns. And I don't know what your view on that was. I certainly know what Dominic Cummings' view was, because he opposed it and was quite explicit about that. Yeah. But there were conversations, weren't there?
My view from the very beginning was that it should be a separate campaign. You know, that's why, for example, Business Britain was set up to be that platform for a campaign later on. So it was always should be a separate campaign. But the outcome did benefit us, yes.
Hi, thank you for listening. Is my mic on? Yeah, can you hear me? Great. So I just wanted to kind of bring the conversation back to what I believe is the most important element of the whole thing, which is young people. I work for an organisation which tries to rebrand politics to engage young people, and I really agree with the lady at the back who brought up demographic as an issue. And I campaigned a lot over the referendum, and what I found was that young people were completely overlooked, with the timing being slap bang in the middle of exams, with voter registration system changing, and with a lot of the issues that young people actually care about not being addressed. And that is even here as well. Young people, the idea of immigration, the issue of immigration actually didn't resonate with young people as much as it did the older generations, and we spent most of the evening talking about immigration.
Can I just ask you one question? I mean, what is young? Just, I mean,
well, I would
seriously.
say it's kind of 16 to 30 kind of age. But
not me. Okay, all right.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Important, and I would be interested to. I just kind of wanted your opinions about that. And Will, you mentioned the strong green going into universities. I was actually a member. I did kind of acknowledge that you did try. We had arch rivals, Students for Britain, as well in there. But one thing that he did say to me, one of the leader of the opposing group, was, "We're not going to bother trying to get young people to vote. We just want people in old people's homes to vote, because actually if young people vote then we'll stay in." And I think that's something that really affected me, and I can't believe someone my own age would have that view. And I just wanted your opinion, because there's a lot of frustration now, myself as a young person included, and the young people I work with, that they just feel continually overlooked and continually as if they don't matter. And even in the snap election, slap bang in the middle of exams again. And there has to be some conversation around this.
Heather, you...
Well, I would only make the... I would make, in a way, the slightly upbeat point, which was that Labour, during the general election, had a campaign that focused very firmly on young people and people in that demographic. The Tories rather ignored them and had nothing to say to them, and got hit rather hard for it. So it seems to me that there will be strategists at the top of all the main parties thinking very, very hard, what can we do to appeal to that group? And actually the Tory manifesto, the dementia tax thing, was meant to be was meant to be about redressing the balance between generations, because it was meant to be, you know, if you're a wealthy older person who's sitting on a house worth a lot of money, you should have to fund your own care. But what wasn't there was the sort of flip side of that was, you know, it should have been, oh, and by the way, if you're a young person, you know, that's great for you, it'll, you know, it'll be good for your taxes, it'll be whatever else. I think there will be people at the top of all the main parties thinking we really, really, really need to do something about this, and we need to think more about this.
So if we just keep moving on with questions. I've reached the stage where I'm going to start staring at my feet because we're getting quite close to the end, but we'll try and squeeze as many in as possible.
Thank you. Why have we heard so little, both during the campaign and this evening, about the moral case for actually us cooperating fully with our European partners? Are we really returning to the neo-colonialist gunboat view that Britain can go out and actually change the world on its own? Or are we seriously going to recognise the realpolitik of the present day, where actually having a common foreign policy with European partners and those issues is going to influence things in the world a lot more? I think we should have sympathy with the British negotiators, because quite frankly, they're between the devil and the deep blue sea. If they win,
do you have
they take us fully...
a concise question?
Yes, the question is this. What is going to be the outcome? Because if they win and they take us fully out of the EU, we're going to end up with a continuing standard of living decline, which everybody's agreed is happening on the panel. We're going to not have the care homes staffed with people, and we're going to end up with an absolute disaster.
Matthew.
I thought it was a comment rather than a question, but you know, when it comes to issues like defence and foreign policy, obviously NATO is crucial to that. And just more generally about your point, nobody's saying that the UK is going to be isolated from the rest of the EU. We're not going to leave the European continent. We're leaving the European Union. So, of course, we will still be a good neighbour. We'll still trade. We'll still work with them on all sorts of different areas, but not be part of their political entity.
The gentleman over there has been waiting ages.
As an under 30, I think it's good to hear from people who voted leave, because we did. Not everybody voted remain. My switching point, I started as a Remainer. I switched when Cameron came out with a terrible deal for us. That wasn't a deal. And I'm interested to know, do you think, following Brexit, do you think the EU can reform and give sovereignty to its states, or is the answer to all problems more Europe?
Well, it's interesting. I think the UK has often been the anchor or the country stopping further EU integration. And we've actually seen signs since the referendum that actually the EU is thinking about the single European army, thinking about further integration of the Eurozone, perhaps some form of common budget. I think Macron talked about more Europe during his campaign. So I think you're right. I think we're going to see further European integration rather than any form of reform there.
I think one of the arguments that we didn't hear during the European referendum was about the leadership role that Britain had played within the European Union over many decades. So the single market, as people here will know, was Margaret Thatcher's baby. You know, she drove that legislation through to create a single trading area and a single market for the benefit of the British economy. Although it obviously ended up with a lot of political difficulties, the decision to allow the 10 Eastern European countries to become part of the EU was a geopolitical act to create a buffer against Russia and its satellites. I mean, we could have managed the migration issue differently, but if that hadn't happened, then with Putin in the ascendant, we don't know what could have happened. Over time, English became the language of the European Union as well. So there were these successes that showed that we had leadership inside the European Union that I don't think we did enough to get across. Now, I think it is, and I think many Europeans feel this as well, to Europe's detriment that we are leaving, because, as Matthew said, we have provided that anchor. And I think that you're certainly going to forget now the conversations about Europe disintegrating. The victory of Macron, whether Merkel or Schulz wins in Germany, you've got a call there. But that used to be balanced by the views of successive British Prime Ministers creating a slightly different Europe than I think we'll have in the future.
There's a gentleman on the horizon.
Thank you. One institution of the EU that hasn't had a lot of discussion is the Court of Justice of the European Union. It's the one institution you can't completely take off the table, because if you do business between the UK and the EU, it has to have a role. The question is, what should that role be? Because we've heard from the government in one sense that it won't have any role, but in other senses it will. Where would you put the red lines? How far should that court be allowed to engage with the UK post-Brexit?
Red line on the European Court of Justice.
Oh, absolutely, we're leaving the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. That must be a red line, because this is all about Britain's sovereignty.
I mean, whatever we end up with, the ECJ will play a role. Because if we want to continue trading with Europe, they will have a role in governing whether our companies have complied with the regulations of the goods that are going into that market.
Just like the US Supreme Court plays a role with the trade with the US.
No, absolutely, but it will still play a role. And the question for me is, does it matter so much to us to take control, as you put it, away from the ECJ, that we are willing to sacrifice, I know your view, sir, but we're willing to sacrifice the benefits that we get from being in the single market and the customs union. And my judgment is that we shouldn't do that. I know that will split people in the audience. What comforts me is that since the election, and we've talked about this tonight, the view of the public is shifting in favour of a softer Brexit. And we saw that with some of the opinion polls at the weekend. And I think we are going on a journey, and as the realities of what a hard Brexit looks like, we will start as a nation to rethink some of these important points.
Do you want to come back or quickly?
Let's keep going.
Okay, I've lost track of where that might... Oh, there it is. Thank you.
Is this Michael?
Yeah.
I was just wondering, ever since the referendum, we've been focusing on passporting for banks and German exporters. What's the chance that the people who actually voted for Brexit's voice is going to be ignored again?
Could you say that again?
I was wondering, was the chance that people who actually voted for Brexit will be ignored again during these negotiations?
So are you saying, are you worried about a fear that Brexit doesn't happen?
Well, not that it doesn't happen, but that the people who voted for it will be ignored by government in the interest of big business.
Oh, I see. So do you think the focus will move back towards sort of big business rather than the people, or the people who voted for Brexit?
I think it would be a huge mistake if voters themselves were ignored during this process, and if the government turned its attention fully to, like you were saying, to the banks and the financial institutions. They do need to keep on listening to people, because if they don't, like I said before, the backlash will be immense. It will make things like the dementia tax seem like a small,
Remember that the government negotiating this deal is a government that is absolutely petrified. Has it's a minority government. It's incredibly vulnerable, and it's petrified of another general election. So I think it will be far from ignoring the voters. I think it will be constantly looking over its shoulder.
I actually saw during the general election, we've discussed this tonight. What happens when you take the voters for granted?
The lady here.
Matthew, is this on?
Yeah,
I think so.
Matthew, do we need a transitional arrangement to take us over the 2-year period? For example, the EEA, as some people like Christopher Booker are advocating, to save us going off a cliff edge, supposedly. What's your opinion?
I think it would be a mistake if we went into the so-called Norway option and stayed part of the EEA. That would be a huge mistake. But if you're saying, at the end of that 2-year period in March 2019, when the final deal happens, there might be some form of transitional arrangement on customs, for example, and perhaps a few other small areas, but not on big things like being a member of the EEA.
So what would our trading relationship be at that point? Because we're not going to, I think, have negotiated a full trade deal by that stage.
I'm confident we will have.
I'll bet you £50 now that we won't have done by March 2019.
I'll happily say
£50.
that.
Thank you very much.
Easy money.
How much will £50 be worth then?
Well, exactly. It might be worth a bit less by then.
Gentleman here. Is there a microphone? Has someone else got the other microphone? Oh, actually, go on then.
Yes. No, I was just going to ask a question, and it partly relates to this belief that the Conservative Party somehow has lost its mandate on its Brexit Manifesto. The Conservative vote went up from 37 to 42.4%. That was the same percentage Margaret Thatcher got in 1983 when she got a landslide. The difference was this time Labour got 40%, last time Labour got 27.6%. But the Tory vote went up 5%. I think there is a mandate for Brexit that was in there, in the same way as Margaret Thatcher had a mandate for her things in 1983. So therefore, surely the Brexit mandate remains enhanced.
Will.
I simply don't think you can say that when you look at the parliamentary arithmetic. You know, the DUP are quite clear about what their priorities are. Yes, they supported Brexit, they supported Matthew's campaign, but they want to preserve a soft border with the Republic of Ireland.
As does the government.
Fine, well, good luck with that if you're going to leave the customs union. And they also are much more liberal about immigration as well. So, I think if you take where the DUP's position is, and then you look at where the Labour Party's position is emerging from the Jeremy Corbyn and Keir Starmer articles in the last week, plus the Green, Lib Dem, the SNP, I think it's going to be very, very hard for Theresa May to prosecute the policy that she set out in her manifesto. And ultimately, that's why Philip Hammond, the Conservative Chancellor, feels able to go on Andrew Marr and say that we need to put the economy first. The sands are shifting on this.
But he said that straight after the referendum. We didn't vote to make ourselves poorer, and actually nothing much came of it. So,
and then there was a plan to sack him.
Locked up for another 11
It was
months.
Heather, do you want to say anything about the point about the election?
Well, what she wanted, what she was asking the voters was to give her a whole bunch of more, kind of docile MPs who'd follow her, go through the voting lobbies, and actually they gave her a bit of a slap in the face and gave her a few MPs. I mean, that's how the electoral arithmetic works. But the fact is, she is going to have problem with every single vote. There's a lot of legislation that needs to be passed to make Brexit happen. We haven't really talked about the practicalities of it. New immigration system, a great repeal bill to bring all the EU. She's going to have to fight for every single one of those votes. So she's going to have to be in touch with MPs on all sides of her own party and MPs across the House to make those things happen.
Matthew, I'm not going to ask you. I'm going to keep moving on if that's all right.
Okay, Will, I mean, the name of this organisation is UK in a Changing Europe.
Say that again.
UK in a Changing Europe.
Excellent.
So you have only focused sort of your arguments from a UK perspective, but you haven't respected the EU. The EU told you that if you leave the EU, you leave the customs union, you leave the single market. But soft Brexiteers, they don't respect the opponents. You don't respect their feelings. And as far as the Changing Europe part goes, the EU is going to implement the 5 presidents report. You're going to have a fiscal union, there is a monetary union, banking union, political union. Yeah, so why didn't you say that the EU is moving in a certain direction and the UK is going in a different direction? Why can't you respect what the UK said and also what the EU is saying? Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I think the European Union, as we know, is a collection of different countries, and they have different views. I mean, the views of the northern European countries, the Scandinavian countries, is very different from the views of some of the core European countries or the southern European countries. So it is by its nature an organisation that, by consensus, moves from period to period. We heard a lot in the referendum about the 5 presidents' report, but there's no plan to implement that by the European Union itself. It does not have consensus among all the different member states that it would need. But look, when we were in the European Union, we had actually managed to secure a whole series of different opt-outs, and we had what I felt was the best of both worlds. Now, the British people made their decision. We are going to leave the European Union. We know that's going to happen. The question now is on what terms. And I simply don't think it's the case, given what Macron was saying at the weekend, that the debate that we have with the European negotiators will mean that we will leave the single market and the customs union. I think that is very much on the table.
Did you want to come in on that one?
I could dig up countless clips of Will during the campaign talking about how a vote to leave is a vote to leave the single market. You said it again and again. You, Lucy, George Osborne, David Cameron, all of you said it. So I think it's very disingenuous, so we should now stay part of the single market.
But you could just argue on the other side as well. Your colleagues like Daniel Hannan, like Owen Paterson, said again and again that we wouldn't leave the single market. So, you can throw quotes back. We are in the reality of where we are now, where there's been a general election, where there was a clear ask of the British people to endorse Theresa May's hard Brexit position that was rejected. That's the reality of where we are. That's where the parliamentary arithmetic is. That's the debate we're going to have over the coming years.
Not that I'm losing control, but wherever that mic is, ask a question.
Can I make... So basically, my question is about military issues. The UK so far has been the country which most benefited from EU investments on military innovation. From a Labour point of view, do you think that the European Union, even after the Brexit, should carry on funding the military innovation and research of the UK? And if yes, what price the UK should be ready to pay for this kind of very important and crucial cooperation?
Was the question about?
So the question was: do you think the UK should break the military cooperation with the EU? Do you think that the UK should stop getting funding for the military innovation? Do you think the UK should work together with the European Union to keep peace and prosperity in all the continent?
Well, we already work together with lots of countries right across the world through NATO, and that's our most important body for cooperating together on a military basis. But just to reiterate the point I made before, there'll be all sorts of areas where we want to continue working with other EU countries on specific things with bilateral agreements, and I'm sure that can happen.
And there's a lady.
Hi, this is Matthew. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm French. I live here. I work here. I pay taxes here. And you've turned me into a bargaining chip. It's been a year. I still don't know what's going to happen to me. What do you have to say?
I think all I can say, speaking on behalf of Vote Leave, if you like, we made it very clear during the referendum, and indeed in the aftermath of the referendum, I signed several letters on this to say that we thought that EU citizens living in the UK should be able to continue living in the UK. We made that very clear. I've got no position with the government, so I can't really speak on their behalf.
I'll back Matthew up here. The Vote Leave campaign and Stronger In both signed statements saying that if we were to leave the European Union, the rights of EU citizens should be protected. And I thought it was outrageous that the government made this a bargaining chip in the negotiations. And I think Matthew agrees with me, although he's being a bit too being sensitive to his Conservative colleagues. But what they have done in stringing this out over a long period of time has put people like your sense of belonging in this country, your ability to plan for the future in jeopardy. And the sooner we can resolve this, the better. And every day that it goes on, I think, is a stain on Theresa May and her government.
Heather, do you want to?
On the citizens' forum, or are you?
I'm thinking of rounding off. Do you want to?
I'm thinking you're rounding off.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I just to say, I just feel for you, and I think it's totally unnecessary to have strung it out over this period, and it's very hard to find anybody who doesn't think that we should do some sort of deal to enable people like you to stay on any side of the politics of it. So.
All right. Hang on. We can't do this. But I would say beware of the difference between people who say they should be allowed to stay and they should have their rights maintained, because they're two very, very different things. Yeah. Listen, I'm very, very sorry. I know a lot of you are going to be furious because you've had your hand up for about a week and I've ignored you, for which I can only apologise. I hope you've enjoyed it nonetheless. I have found it absolutely fascinating. I'd be grateful if you could just, well, A, obviously, sign up to our newsletter, but B, equally importantly, thank our panellists tonight. Thank you. That's fantastic. That's really good.